Hey CW Apes, Mr. Kennedy here. We're going to spend some time at the tail end of your Chapter 5 notes here talking about biogeochemical cycles. Now I'm hoping that most of this is familiar to you, but if not, now's your chance to get it down. First cycle we're going to look at is the hydrologic cycle. This is the path water takes as it moves through the environment. Basically, solar energy continually evaporates water that's stored both in the oceans and on land, causing that water to rise up into the atmosphere. Atmospheric conditions, winds, jet stream, that moves that water all around the globe. That water, once it moves over land, especially when it hits things like mountains, will start to condense and, you guessed it, rain. That's what supports all of our terrestrial ecosystems. It's responsible for cellular metabolism, nutrient flow. Well, really the entire global distribution of heat and energy starts with this hydrologic cycle. You might remember it from elementary school, junior high as the simple water cycle. So this is it. We've got heat energy from the sun causing evaporation. Evaporated water goes up into the atmosphere, is distributed globally by prevailing winds when it moves over the land. Right? That's when condensation occurs. Rain, snow, sleet, all that happens. The water moves down through rivers, lakes, and streams and eventually makes it back out to the ocean. Next one we got to look at is the carbon cycle. Carbon cycle begins with the intake of CO2 during photosynthesis. Carbon atoms are incorporated into sugars like glucose, and those same carbon atoms are going to be released by cellular respiration in either a plant or an organism that consumed the plant. Sometimes the carbon isn't recycled for a really long time, and that's where we get coal and oil from, the remnants of both plants and animals that lived literally millions of years ago. The carbon in these reserves, if you will, isn't released until those fossil fuels are burned, right? Some carbon is also locked up in calcium carbonate, which is the fossil shell deposits in limestone. Well, the only way you can get at that, again, is to break down that limestone. Carbon cycle, has parts that, remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and parts that add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. The parts of the cycle that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, like vegetation, well, those are called carbon sinks. That's a term that you better learn well. We need to protect our carbon sinks. That's the only way we can get CO2 out of the atmosphere naturally. The parts of the cycle that release or put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere or out are our carbon sources. Burning fossil fuels generates massive quantities of carbon dioxide, and, simply put, our carbon sinks can't keep up. So if our population keeps getting bigger and we keep removing plant cover, then the CO2 is just going to sit there in the atmosphere until, we do something about it. This is a picture of what the carbon cycle looks like, right? Just explaining all of those parts all over again. So when you think about burning fossil fuels, we're putting CO2 in the atmosphere, right? The only way we're going to get CO2 out is through photosynthesis, okay? So that's just kind of the heart of the carbon cycle. Photosynthesis takes CO2 out. Burning of fossil fuels, any kind of combustion, respiration in and of itself from all life puts CO2 back up in the atmosphere. The ocean can also absorb some of that CO2 because CO2 does like water. That sounds like a good thing, but unfortunately that's also acidifying our ocean. So there's a trade-off, give and take. Next cycle is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is needed to make proteins and nucleic acids like DNA, which you learned way back in chapter 2. Plants take up inorganic nitrogen from the environment and they build proteins which are later eaten by consumers. Now, to get at that nitrogen, really what you need is a symbiotic relationship between plants and bacteria, nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Those nitrogen-fixing bacteria are kind of the only creatures on Earth that can break the triple bond that exists between two nitrogen atoms and convert that nitrogen into other things like nitrates and nitrites or maybe even ammonia. that organisms further down the food chain can make use of, right? So it's really, really important to understand that, yeah, plants take up the inorganic nitrogen from the environment. They build those proteins, right? But it's really the relationship with that bacteria and their roots that makes that possible. Nitrogen re-enters the environment when organisms die or when organisms excrete. Nitrogen re-enters the atmosphere when denitrifying bacteria break down nitrates into nitrogen gas and nitrous oxide, or NO2 gases. Humans, man, we have profoundly altered the nitrogen cycle through the use of synthetic fertilizers, nitrogen-fixing crops, and again, fossil fuels. By throwing it out of whack, we've got larger and larger concentrations of nitrogen in the atmosphere in places where you have big cities, and it's a huge contributor to photochemical smog and that brown air that you tend to see lingering over those areas. This is an example of what the nitrogen cycle looks like. Hopefully you'll have a chance to play our nitrogen cycle game and kind of map out how the nitrogen cycle works at that level. Alright, this is a picture of those root nodules that exist in that symbiotic relationship with plants. And without them, plants wouldn't be able to absorb or do anything with the nitrogen that's in the air around them. Last cycle that I'm going to share with you is the phosphorus cycle. It's needed, phosphorus itself is needed to make DNA, ATP, and RNA, all those nucleic acids. Basically, you got to have phosphorus, right? Now, when it comes to phosphorus, there's a fast cycle for phosphorus and a slow cycle for phosphorus. Phosphorus compounds on the slow cycle tend to be leached from rocks and minerals and transported in aqueous form where other life forms can then absorb them. That's a really, really slow process. The fast track involves the phosphorus which has already been absorbed simply being passed on from producer to consumer and then eventually returned to the environment by decomposition. So if you look at each of those two bullets there independently, there's your slow and fast track phosphorus cycle. If you put the whole thing together, well, phosphorus cycle as a whole is slow. The cycle takes a long time, and that's why we got to be careful with our phosphorus and how quickly we deplete it. So here's a picture of the phosphorus cycle so you kind of get an idea of where the phosphorus enters and leaves the ecosystem. Alright gang, that's a real quick coverage of the biogeochemical cycles. I hope you've enjoyed it. That brings chapter 5 to a close. I'm Mr. Kennedy. This video will always be on my YouTube channel and handouts to go with it on our class webpage. See you next time.